Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 69 of That's a Good Question. How should Christians relate to culture? Well, we're glad to be back this week with another episode of That's a Good Question. And every now and then, our schedules require that we take a week off from recording. And when that happens, we always encourage our viewers to take a look at episodes you may have missed. And it's all of our viewers, both of you.
Our wives.
There's got to be something you've missed. And I've recommended in the past some episodes that I've found personally most beneficial. But if you've missed an episode, go back and check those out whenever you don't see a new one. But normally we put those out on Saturdays at 2 p.m. And I guess I'll take this opportunity to remind folks, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That'll let you know when we have new episodes, and you can go check them out. Just about every week we do that. But today we want to address the question, how should Christians relate to culture? Because we're living in a time in America where it's starting to get more and more clear every day that there's no longer a Christian consensus, what we can call it, in our society that's been there for most of our nation's history. And I want to clarify when I say that, Christian consensus, I don't mean that there's been a point at which, we were a Christian nation, that everybody or a majority of people in our country were Christians personally, born again, but rather that, you and I grew up in a time where the environment was significantly under the influence of Christian principles. There were Christian values that permeated the way people lived. There were things like blue laws. So, nothing that was open on Sundays, and it was understood that things like if you were going to have a baby, you were married. Those were just the norms of our culture at the time. Things, you couldn't say certain things on television or show certain things on television.
Elvis made his first TV appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, and they made it a point to just show him from the waist up because his performance was considered to be too overtly sexual.
Yeah, it was scandalous, and now people are like, "What? What's he's dancing? What's the big deal?" Yeah. So, or you think of like married couples couldn't be shown in the same bed together on TV and movies.
That shows that you're taking it a bit far when married couples, can only be assumed to have separate beds. But nevertheless, that was the mores.
But it does show then in our culture then how far we've come. Not that we're saying that everything about that was perfect, like you're saying, but how far change.
For sure. The year I was born, the Supreme Court ruled that it's unconstitutional to have prescribed prayer in school. The following year, mandatory Bible reading was deemed unconstitutional.
Yeah, and again, the other end of that spectrum, we're not saying that all of these things are the role of government necessarily, but just that, again, these show that things are different now than they were in your and my lifetime growing up, just that recently. I was looking back at an episode today, actually, where I made fun of you turning 59. So here I am talking about how in your lifetime is recent. I just want to point that out.
Nice.
And some of our church's older members, they attended schools where prayer and Bible reading were regular parts of the daily schedule. And so that has been a shift. And now we have behaviors that are legal in public that would have been unthinkable just 20 years ago. So that's partly what gives rise to today's question. How should Christians then relate to culture? Because there's a growing sense in which our Christian values are out of step with the culture. And that's an adjustment for many of us, not because it's never been like this in history. This is some new thing. But in our time, it's new.
It's new. And there's a danger, it's not all good to have a Christian consensus. There is actually a danger with that because you can come to rely on it as being necessary in order to live as a Christian, because you're used to living as a Christian in that kind of an environment. Consider if we did not have the freedom to assemble. Would our mission go on? Well, of course it would. And it is, in fact, right now at this very moment in many parts of the world under those kinds of conditions. And it has literally for centuries. But when you become accustomed to being favored in the culture, then it can be difficult to know how to respond when you're not. And especially if you're disfavored. So one principle we all need to really bear in mind is that if our Christianity is dependent on time and place, then it is too tied to the culture. Because Christianity is intentionally what one, probably other authors, but Gene Getz, years ago I read him, calling it supra-cultural.
I don't remember where I heard it first, probably from you quoting that, but that immediately was very helpful term for me.
Because he's saying that our mission can go forward, whatever culture we're in, because it's based on beliefs and values that transcend. Whatever culture you're in, it's not tied to culture. And if it were, Getz was very fond of saying, then the Great Commission would have stayed in Jerusalem. It could not go forward. So he made the distinction often, and I've made it then following him, between form and function. That the Bible gives us functions that we are to carry out, evangelism and edification and worship and fellowship and those kinds of things. But the forms are supracultural. Those functions are supracultural. But the forms, then, you have to choose the methods, the way you're going to do those things, evangelism, edify, worship, fellowship, then those have to be chosen in line with a particular culture. If you can only do ministry in a Christian environment, then you're missing something. I have a friend. He is an expert, a bona fide expert musicologist, truly an expert with a doctorate. He teaches at seminary level. He studied the history, you know him. He studied the history of music in general, of Christian music in particular, but he's a high culture kind of guy. And so he advocates for highbrow music in the church. And if you read his material, he's written several books. He talks about, I don't know that he uses this word, but almost the golden age of Christian arts. And when you look at the age he's describing, it was when the church controlled everything in the West, especially in Europe. And it's a time that historians call Christendom, when there was a mix of Christianity and earthly kingdom, thus Christendom. But, Christendom really was not all it's cracked up to be. With the church wedded to the power of the state, it meant that the church had, yes, resources from taxation, and so could sponsor high culture and the use of the arts for Christian use. And so some very beautiful things were done. Michelangelo, right, paints the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling. It's a marvel, right? But they could afford to do that.
But also fraught with all kinds of pitfalls.
So you get the sense sometimes that people are nostalgic for longing for those kind of good old days. In his writing, he's regularly urging us to produce that kind of stuff that was created under Christendom. But too many people have that kind of nostalgia.
We can have that same kind of nostalgia in our place, our time in America. We look back on how it was when it was easy, or at least easier. And we might think, how can we minister when people think we're so strange and maybe even hate what we stand for,
Boy, I wonder if there's ever been a time where Christians were treated like that, where they were aliens and strangers.
How could the gospel possibly go forward if our rights are taken away?
Exactly, right. But we get so accustomed to it that it's easy to think that. So, and of course we know that, in fact, being aliens and strangers, being the outsiders, has been the rule.
I should throw in, I don't want to get pegged as I make fun of that sometimes in the way I say it, but, we're supposed to pray for peace and that our mission might go forward in that type of an environment. And we've dealt with that topic before too. But that being said, continue.
The rule, but the rule has been, it's been otherwise.
Yes.
That's the very reason you have to pray for it. Because you don't have it, right? So it's been the exception to have what we have had, because even under Christendom, the ecclesiastical authority was the Roman Catholic Church, which really didn't have any tolerance for people like us reading the Bible on our own, saying that people could have a relationship with God outside the sacraments of the institutional church. So what we've had in America is distinct, if not unique, but it's also not necessary. Let me say that again. I want to say that again. What we have had in America is distinct, if not unique. Certainly it has been a blessing. But friends, we need to understand it's not necessary to the advance of Christ's cause. So we need to adjust to that truth, so that we don't wig out, so that we don't fret as if we cannot carry out God's work until America turns back to God or something like that. Mm-hmm. In fact, as it gets harder, I personally think our witness is going to be enhanced, because you start to filter out the fair weather Christians.
You know, just before you continue on to that, because what you're about to say, I can tell is really, really important. But I hear echoing in my mind when you say what you said leading up to this, you know, quoting the verse that says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray. And it talks about rescuing the nation. And you hear that quoted as if when we do that, God will rescue America. That's not talking about us.
That's good. That's good, right.
Is that Jeremiah?
No, it's 1 Chronicles 7:14.
1 Chronicles, thank you, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, 7:14, and I believe. I'm not quite sure. And but yeah, it's about Israel.
Yeah.
As a chosen nation.
And it's a very specific promise in response to a curse that had been laid out just prior to that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but we apply it to America. We get lots of preachers. I mean, I don't mean to, this guy I'm going to mention is very helpful to my wife and to me, I think to you and Julie as well, when you were raising your kids. James Dobson, Focus on the Family, a lot of the principles he had, a lot of the books he had, we've recommended those. But Dobson would, make these statements. He got political a bit himself because he got concerned about America changing. This is a different world than he certainly grew up in. He was worried about what that was going to mean for the family and all of that. And he would talk in terms that he would use Old Testament examples that applied to Israel as if they applied to America. And lots of people do that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we don't have to have a comfortable relationship with the culture to live as Christians and to carry out the Great Commission. But we need to ask ourselves then, what concern or responsibility for the culture should we have then, if any? Now that has been an issue that has occupied the minds of Christian thinkers for a very long time. And as usual, they tend to overcomplicate it. So I'm here to simplify things, since I'm pretty much a simpleton and I have to simplify it for my own benefit. But the first thing that we need to distinguish is between the world and the culture. Because the word world, as used in your New Testament, translation of the Greek word cosmos, so you see world a lot. The Apostle John uses that Greek word a lot. And so the most well-known verse in the Bible, God so loved the world, the cosmos, but it's used in a negative sense. If you look and see what the Bible says about the world, 1 John 2:15, do not love the world, neither the things that are in the world, right? So it's used in this negative sense, because what that means in Scripture is it's the arrangement, the cosmos arranged against God. That's what makes John 3:16 all the more profound then. God so loved that was hostile toward him. So that's the world, it's negative. Then you have culture. Culture is something else. It's my homemade definition, but it's the collective set of societal values that you see in customs, in media, entertainment, in the arts. Collective set of a society's values as seen in its customs, fashions, media, entertainment, and the arts. So the world is bad in Scripture. Culture may be, but it may not be. But if you equate the two, world and culture, then culture is always bad. So if you need to determine whether you should do something if you just say world and culture are the same and they're always bad, then all you have to do is see if it's happening in the culture, and if so, you don't do it because it's bad, because the culture is worldly. That's what gave rise to many of the kinds of things that we remember, and probably some of our...
just was going to cite one of those. I remember, hearing things said like, don't wear that, that's what the world wears. And I would look around and see people wearing suits out in the world too, and be like, well, wait a minute. And it was because I was not being helped. And I'm not saying that anyone taught me that per se, but I wasn't being helped to understand exactly what you're saying, that the culture and the world are not synonyms, equal.
Exactly. Yeah. So what you were seeing, they might have been seeing something that the world was doing that maybe you shouldn't. I use this one a lot just because I'm old, but goth. I don't know if anybody still dresses in goth. But that was a thing. It may still be a thing. I don't know. But it was a thing that Christian people should avoid. You shouldn't want to emulate that kind of macabre, kind of emphasis on dark and death and those kinds of things. But so if you had young people, if you had a teenager and your own teenager doing that, you'd want to talk with them about that and say the world is doing that. That would actually be accurate.
And I'll tell you, even better than that is asking them why they're interested in that. And then you get to the heart of the matter.
That's true.
So.
Yeah. And then you can explain this, though. If a parent knows this distinction, I think it's very helpful to make to our kids. This is okay. This is the world. This is what the Bible says about the world.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean everything out there is bad. And that's why the suit might be okay. But if you don't make the distinction, then you look at it and you say, well, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of stuff out there that you're emulating. And we didn't have a ready way to explain that because we didn't make this, I think, very important distinction between the world and the culture. The world's always bad. Culture might be, but it might not be. It can actually have good elements in it. The reason the culture can have good elements is because of God's common grace. We have to then discern what elements in culture are God's common grace, as even people outside of Christ, are reflecting the image of God. I don't know if we grasp that. I don't know if we understand that, but people outside of Christ still have the image of God. Now it's marred, and it still is for me, and it still is for you, even as Christians. But it's being restored, but gradually. But we still bear at least a distorted version of the image of God. We know this from Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6, where the Bible institutes capital punishment, but gives the reason for capital punishment is that a person who takes the life of another human being has taken the life of one who reflects the image of God, it says. And that's after the fall of Genesis chapter 3. So even after sin, people in the world, everybody still has some vestige of the image of God. And so now in culture, they may be reflecting elements of the image of God. The very image of the God whom they ignore, maybe even hate, but nevertheless, they have gifts and abilities that come from him, and in a limited way, they're reflecting him, even without knowing it and caring about it. So here's something you've heard me say before. Here's a definition of worldliness. Worldliness is not just whatever the world is doing. Worldliness is fallen values expressed in culture. Fallen values, sinful values expressed in culture. And we have to discern fallen versus godly values.
That's good. Jesus talked about this, the relationship of his people to the world. And I've heard you distill that in a helpful way in the past, a way that I think that would benefit this discussion.
So yeah, that's where Jesus talked about that. Many of our viewers will remember Jesus talking about being in the world but not of the world. But he was doing that in John chapter 17. John chapter 17 is the night before he is crucified, and he's actually praying in John chapter 17. It's a prayer from Jesus to the Father, and he prays in the first few verses for himself. But then right after he prays for himself, he prays for his first followers, the apostles. And then later, down in verse 20, I think it is, the end of the chapter, he actually prays for those who will believe their message in the future. He prays.
That's an awesome thing to read, isn't it?
Come on.
There's Jesus praying for you and me.
You and me in the future, those who will believe his message. That would be us. That would be any of you who have heard the message of Christ and responded to it, knowing that he is going to die for us that next day. But it's in that context that he says, these followers of mine, Father, he's praying, they are in the world. I am leaving them and I am sending them. You've sent me. I'm sending them. They are in the world, but they are not of the world. So that's the proper relationship to the world. We're in it. We're surrounded by the arrangement, the cosmos. We're located in physically, but we are not of. That is, our values are not derived from the world. So they're not fallen values. They need to be godly values. And even non-Christian people, as I've said, can reflect those godly values because of the image of God. So in, but not of, okay? But you can have different ways that people, different groups, reflect that relationship. You can have people who are both in and of, in the world and of the world. Okay, they're in it, but their values are derived from it as well. So in and of. Jesus says in, but not of. You get people that in and of. That would be your standard pagan, your standard non-saved, non-Christian person. But you can have people who are not in and not of. Well, what's that? I mean, we're supposed to be in, but not of.
That's life in the bubble.
Life in a bubble, whatever kind of bubble you create. And in history, church history, and even in our own day, we lots of ways to create the bubble. Monastics, right? A monk. Our Amish friends would do that. Really, with some of what I grew up in, my holiness background, some of our fundamentalist kind of background, where we would separate in ways where we were in the bubble. In the bubble in a way that kept us from the culture. All the while, we're trying to keep us from the world, but we're actually keeping us from the culture because we didn't make that important distinction. So you can be not in and not of. You can be not in, but you can be of. And this is kind of the evangelical ethos that we've had over the last several decades. Where,
so like celebrity pastors and
yes, yeah, and TV shows and all kinds of
Christian version of everything.
Yeah, we kind of got a little TV show here.
There we go. There we go.
But a Christian version of
Just
everything.
wait till we start our network.
We start asking for a lot of money, you'll know where we're headed. So, or any money for that matter. But not in, meaning we got our own thing. You guys are worldly. We've got our own version of it. But then all the values, actually, that surround what we're doing, actually, we borrowed those from the world to begin with. That's what I mean by not in, but you're still of. But it's supposed to be in, Jesus says, the world, but not of. I've recently been reading a book by Tim Keller. It's called Center Church. It's his magnum opus. He has pastored for decades, done a lot of teaching and writing, and it's really a profound book. So I want to share some of what he says about how the church relates to the culture. But a quick disclaimer, not everything that anybody pretty much we recommend, do you agree with every last thing? And that's certainly true for Keller. So I want to make sure that's clear, because if you've heard something about Keller, and there are a handful of things to question, then please understand it doesn't mean I'm endorsing those. And even in the book, even though that book is Center Churches, is profound, I do take issue with some of what he says that I think can lead to a pragmatic kind of approach to ministry. And I think he does that more than he realizes. Like he says in this book, that the goal of our ministry should be, here's his word, fruitfulness. And he even juxtaposes fruitfulness with faithfulness. And he says, as I read and I reflected and I taught, I came to the conclusion that a more biblical theme for ministerial evaluation than either success or faithfulness is fruitfulness. That a better way to evaluate than faithfulness is fruitfulness. All right, I won't go, because that's not my point of bringing it up.
Bad news for the prophets.
Yes, exactly. What kind of fruit, right? Yeah. So he's making a good point as usual, but he should make it in a different way. And then the way he makes it can lead toward a kind of pragmatism to be fruitful. All right. But as I say, as usual, he's got some very, very helpful insights. And in his book, he quotes a guy named Richard Niebuhr, who wrote this famous book called Christ and Culture. Christ and Culture. I've seen it over the years. I've read different books, and I see that I have that book, but I've seen it referenced as much as any other book, probably, other than the Bible. This book, Christ and Culture. And he's got these 5 ways to relate to culture. I just went through the in and of, and not in, not of, all of that. Well, he does a similar sort of thing. There's Christ against culture. And he says that's a withdrawal model of removing yourself from the culture into the church. All right. He's got the Christ of culture. That's an accommodationist model. Recognizes God's at work in the culture, looks for ways to affirm what God is doing. Then there's a third one, Christ above culture. It's a synthetic model. It advocates supplementing and building on the good in culture with Christ. Fourth one, he's got 5 of these, Christ and culture in paradox. It's a model that views Christians as citizens in 2 different realms, one that's sacred, one that's secular. And then the last one, Christ transforming culture. That's a conversionist model. It seeks to transform every part of the culture with Christ. So here's an illustration. Keller uses this illustration to kind of explain all of that. He says, think of a particular cultural product, say a computer. The Christ against culture person may refuse to use it because it undermines human community.
Did you ever hear that audio clip? I don't own a computer. I don't want a computer. It's spooky to me. Have you ever heard that?
No.
I think it's a Jack Hyles audio clip.
Oh, well, the way you said it sounds like Jack Hyles.
Yeah, I had never really heard him speak other than that.
Yeah, that sounded like Jack
I had that for a long time. I may have it on my computer.
Oh, I could definitely
on my
see
computer somewhere. I may have that file.
I could see him saying that for sure. Yeah, so there's a Luddite, kind of an approach to it, a Christian Luddite, Then there's the Christ against culture approach. They may refuse to use it because it undermines, that one undermines human community. Then there's Christ of culture. The person's going to adopt it fully, assured that it's something that God has brought about. It's all good. The Christ above culture person will adopt it, but only uses it for evangelism and Christian teaching. Then you got Christ and culture and paradox. They'll use the computer, but they'll be wary, take great care not to indulge too deeply. And then you've got Christ transforming culture. This person's going to study the effects of computers on human relationships, communities, and character, develop particular ways to use it so they can support human flourishing, as the Bible defines it. So Keller then goes and makes his own. Those are the 5 that Niebuhr has. But he's got Transformationist, a relevance model, a counterculturalist model, and then a 2 kingdoms model. Let me just real quick. I said I was going to make this simpler. I was going
to say, I've got a couple of lists swimming in my mind now.
I know, sorry.
Download the diagram. I'm just kidding. There's no diagram. But.
The transformationist one is that you penetrate the culture and you change it with your power. Now, this is important. Forget the word transformationist, but you penetrate the culture. That's the idea. And you change it. You change it, though, with power. That's one version of this transformation approach. And that would be the Christian right. That would be political power. And then an extreme version of that would be in dominionism. Some of you know what that is. Most of you probably don't, and that's okay. Or theonomy, or reconstructionism. That's saying we're going back to the Old Testament wholesale. We said earlier that some people inadvertently just don't make these important distinctions between the Old Testament and Israel and what God's doing with the church and the Gentiles and the world, in the New Testament and the Great Commission. But here, this is a very deliberate and thoughtful, but wrong approach to saying, no, everything that God has said going back to the Old Testament is applicable today. All of the laws of the Old Testament need to be instituted today. And so by power, by political power, by governmental power, you would then impose that. Another way, though...
And that seems to be a very popular growing trend. It's alarming to me how many people I hear talking that way.
You should be alarmed by it. I mean, we've got...
And how many people I wouldn't expect it from.
And yeah, in Phoenix, right? So Jeff Durbin, right? Theonomist, that's what those guys are doing. Yeah. So don't do that. Okay. Yeah. I mean, Westminster Seminary, back several decades ago, they actually got their whole faculty together. They were so concerned about this. And Westminster is not, they don't believe exactly what we believe in terms of the relationship of the Christian to the Old Testament.
Right.
They still believe more of the Old Testament's applicable in terms of the law. They believe in the ceremonial law is still the moral law, of the Old Testament is still in effect. But the civil and ceremonial is done away with. We would say, no, it's all gone. We've got Christ's law in the New Testament.
Dr. Combs
He
provided a great treatment of that. Yeah, in our second hour
recently. Weeks ago. That's right. I forgot
you
that.
can look up if you haven't seen it. Highly recommend it. It's the New Testament Christian and the Old Testament law.
That's right. It was. Yeah.
I think 2 weeks.
Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, excellent. But they believe, we are under some aspects of the law, but even they were so alarmed about this theonomy thing that they got the whole faculty together and they wrote on it. You could Google that, Westminster Seminary and Reconstructionism or theonomy. But another version of this, though, transformationist approach is not just doing it transforming by power, by political power, but by ideas, worldview advocates.
Okay.
But really, you need to change by our ideas and our example. And that's one of the, we've talked a lot about worldview. You are very much into worldview in a good way. You've taught that to our young people for a lot of years, and they've all been helped by it so that they can go out into the world and then they could approach ideas in the marketplace of ideas, right?
Yeah, and in looking at, as you approach those conversations, looking at all of it through a grid that God's Word provides, kind of like a system of truth you can evaluate it by.
But, and I know you would agree with this, but sometimes worldview can be just philosophical, can be just ideas. And for the Christian, it's never that. It is the ideas and our example. And both of those are an apologetic. It's both. It's not just the ideas. Some people are won by just intellectual persuasion, but other people are won by seeing your life, and your life needs to back it up in either way.
And this is just, this is anecdotal, but my experience is that your example is actually one of the more powerful of the two. It is living a life that adorns the gospel in the words of the New Testament. So then your message has credibility. You can't argue against.
But you've seen this. So with worldview and a transformationist approach, and you say, okay, I'm going to persuade people by the ideas of the Bible, looking at life through a biblical lens. But then you still have to be careful with that, very careful, that you are looking through a biblical lens, not an applicational lens of what the Bible says, and making that your worldview. Here's an example. Capitalism. Is capitalism the only biblical economic model? A lot of people would say yes to that. I would not say yes to that. Now, I think was it Winston Churchill who said of democracy?
The email address to write in is...
Was it Churchill who said, of democracy, I think it was, it's the worst of all systems except all the others? And, same applies to capitalism. Capitalism has got all its issues. You do see capitalists then amassing wealth in ways that are just insane.
It's built on, in large part, correct anthropology that we're all greedy sinners.
Yeah, and so you'll keep working hard to try to make more money, which keeps the engine going, and that's why it works. Yeah. So I think it's the best. Okay, so don't have to send those letters.
You were going to say something.
I was starting to. No, don't send them at all. But I'm not going to make the case that you can make that from the Bible. I've seen people try to do this. Thou shalt not steal. Then means there's private property, which then you get to Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations, and that's quite a leap. Is all I'm saying. But
it's also in a way saying we could never learn anything new.
Yes.
We've discovered it all.
Yeah.
That's never a good thing to say.
So in this approach, Christians should be laboring to transform culture to literally change the world. You've heard of a guy named, and some of you may have heard of Abraham Kuyper, 130 years ago, turn of the last century. He was the prime minister of the Netherlands. He was a politician, but also really a first-rate theologian as well. And he wrote a lot of books that are quite helpful. This was his approach, though, that this transformationist kind of approach.
Just received an email talking a little bit about this today from Church History Institute, or I forget where it's from.
There you go. He influenced a lot of people that many of us know and have benefited from. I benefited from Francis Schaeffer a lot, but he was very influenced by Kuyper. Charles Colson, some of you know that name, both of the late Schaeffer and Colson. But he's also influenced the theonomists that we talked about, including our friends out in Phoenix. So focus on transformation means you're not evaluated so much based on who you are, but what you accomplish. We've got something to do. I'm not saying that any of these folks don't care about living the Christian life or any of that, but the thing is, we need to accomplish this. We need to establish this. Okay, that's transformation. This relevance model takes a positive view of culture. You want to be in step with it. You want to be relevant. So that's the relevance idea.
I feel like that was in its day in the 90s through the early 2000s, in the whole seeker-sensitive movement.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. That's who would fall under this. And you say its day. That was the heyday.
Well, I see a lot of waking up from or reaction to that now.
Totally. We have people at our church.
Yeah.
Right? Who've come to our church and just go, okay, I saw the show. Now what? And how do I grow? And there's no real answer to that. back Willow Creek Community Church outside Chicago.
You're probably going to get to this. I won't always tend to kind of jump ahead on this, but as you talk about this, I'm thinking to myself, man, a biblical model is just kind of quiet and understated, faithful, and neither of these.
Not the show, not the flash, not the right. Yeah, exactly. Just getting it done.
Well, and even the prior model you were
Faithfully.
describing about, the world changing through acquiring the power and
Right, both.
it's much less, the biblical model is much more underwhelming, just faithfulness to.
Yep, you're right. No, you're right. And you're also right about the Secret Service, Willow Creek Community Church outside of Chicago, late 70s. They really started this, got it going. It just took the country by storm, really, over the last several decades. But over time, the novelty wore off. And then people said, I need something with some more substance. Willow Creek did its own survey of its own people in the mid-2000s and came out with a report, and they were shocked that people had not been discipled, that people didn't know basic sorts of things because they had been coming to see this show designed for seekers. Well, what about after I've made a decision for Christ? Now what? How do I grow? And there just wasn't a whole lot for that. So then you have this relevance idea. The primary idea is to engage culture, and then for the church to adapt to the new realities of the culture, connect to what God's doing in the world. Christians and churches that emphasize this kind of thing, those who embrace this relevance model, they share a bunch of common characteristics. Bill Hybels is the Willow Creek guy. Remember Rick Warren and Saddleback out in California? They were doing this. But churches that we would characterize as being in the seeker movement still rely heavily on techniques of business and marketing, technology, product development, strong emphasis on self-fulfillment and all of those kinds of things. The church then, in short, becomes like the world to reach the world, is kind of the idea. That's the relationship to the culture. Counterculturalist is really just who cares about the culture? And that's not a proper approach either. Yes, we take a quiet approach. We kind of do our thing, but it's not that we don't care about the culture. D.A. Carson says this. He says, sometimes a disease can be knocked out. Sometimes sex traffic can be considerably reduced. Sometimes slavery can be abolished. We know Wilberforce did that. We know Christians were responsible for that in England and in America. Sometimes more equitable laws can foster justice and reduce corruption. Yet in these and countless other ways, cultural change is possible, he's saying. More importantly, doing good to the city, doing good to all people, even if we have a special responsibility to the household of faith, which the Bible does say, do good to all men, but especially to the household of faith. It says that, Galatians 6:10. But part of our responsibility as God's redeemed people is to try to have this positive impact if we can. But we do ministry in a culture, and so we can't say we don't care about the culture, that we're counterculturalist. And at a minimum, we need to concern ourselves with how we're viewed by the culture. And then the last model is this two kingdoms model. Comes from a teaching that says, God rules all of creation through his common kingdom, and he's got this common kingdom is one of the two, and people in that kingdom are not Christian necessarily, but they have his natural revelation. They have general revelation to be guided. But then you have the redemptive kingdom, and that's Christians, and we're ruled by the Bible. We're ruled by special revelation. That one, you have this really expansive view of common grace, that you don't really need the Bible or any of that for the outsiders, because God has so made it that they can run the world based upon what he has revealed in nature. Now, the biblical understanding of our own fallenness, that we are cursed and yet we're still sustained by common grace, is really important for us to understand if we're going to relate to culture properly. The world itself is inherently the physical world. I don't mean the cosmos, but the physical world, the physical earth, money, for example. Sometimes people say money is the root of all evil. But that's a huge mistake, right?
It's a misquote, yeah.
Misquote. Love of money. The money is neutral.
And not even all evil. It's the love of money and the root of all kinds of evil.
All kinds
right?
of evil. Yeah, that's right. So, but sometimes we make that mistake. We see the physical thing as the problem, and the physical thing is never the problem. In fact, God called all of that very good. Now it takes part in the curse, and it's under the frustration of the fall and all of that.
That view can actually cause all kinds of problems, seeing the evil being in the thing.
Oh yeah, now remove it from me.
Now you avoid the thing, you avoided the evil.
Yes.
And you're self-deceived.
Yeah, and you take the evil with you in your heart, right, to whatever thing you resorted to. So, it's sustained by common grace. It was pronounced by God to be good. And Christians, likewise, are redeemed and saved, and yet we still have remaining indwelling sin. So Keller says the battle line between God and idols not only runs through the world, it runs through the heart of every believer. So the work and cultural productions of Christians and non-Christians will both have idolatrous and God-honoring elements in them. Both will. Cultural products should not be judged as good if Christians make them or bad if non-Christians make them. Each should be evaluated on its own merits.
Now that helps make some sense of things.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think. And Kevin DeYoung, some of you guys know that, he says this. Perhaps there's a middle ground. I say, let's not lose the heart of the gospel, divine self-satisfaction through self-substitution. And let's not apologize for challenging Christians to show the same kind of dying love to others. Let's not be embarrassed by the doctrines of hell and necessity of repentance and regeneration. Let's not be afraid, though, to do good to all people, especially to the household of faith. Let's work against injustices and suffering in our day. Let's be realistic that the poor, as Jesus said, will always be among us. Bottom line, let's work for change where God calls us and gifts us, but let's not forget that the Great Commission is to go into the world and make disciples, not into the world to build the kingdom, he says. Helpful, right? One last distinction, okay? There's this institutional church versus organic church distinction, and I find this to be a helpful one. We need to be reminded of a distinction between the church as an institution and then the church as the people who comprise it. The institutional church is the gathered church, organized under its officers and its ministers, what we would normally call the local church. And so we preach the gospel, we baptize, we make disciples. Then there's the organic church. That's all Christians living in the world who've been discipled and equipped to bring the gospel to bear on all of life. And we shouldn't think of Christians out in the world as distinct and detached, just out doing their own thing. They are the body of Christ. They are the church. As Christians in the world, we are still to think and to work together, banding together in creative ways. Hear this now. Being the church organic that the church institutional discipled them to be. Isn't that a great thing? That's again a quote from Keller. But it's the institutional church, the church in which we work and serve, and the gathered church, the local church. But we're discipling people to go out and do that in the organic church.
I love that recognizes the relationship, not pit the concepts against each other.
Exactly. So I think that's enough for today.
All right. Well, I appreciate you all joining us for this episode. This topic is a very important one that I'm sure we could devote several episodes to. It's really what we're encouraging and preparing people to do week in and week out. Yes. Interact, live in the culture where God has put you. So thanks for watching, and remind you one more time just to subscribe and make sure you enable notifications so you know when our new episodes come out. We try to release one just about every Saturday at 2 p.m., and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next episode. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.